Hello, my name is Angela Harris. I'm Professor Emerita at the University of California at Davis School of Law, and I'm also the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Political Economy, one of the institutional sponsors of the Just Transition Leadership Institute. I'm so excited and grateful that you're here today. I'm speaking with you from the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people, currently called Berkeley, California. I want to thank the original stewards of this land and acknowledge their descendants who continue the work. I have a few notes for you before we get started. First, this lecture is about an hour long, and that's a long time to sit in front of a screen. Throughout my talk, I'll indicate places where it might be a good moment for you to press pause, take a bio break, jot down a few questions, comments, or thoughts for discussion with your group, or just get up and stretch. Second, I want to remind you that if you have time and interest in further reading, there's a bibliography accompanying this lecture, listing some of the books and articles that I've relied on while putting this together. And third, I just want to warn you, there's so much I'm excited to talk about. So I've got a script and I'm talking fast. I apologize for occasional stumbles. So with that, get comfortable, settle in, and I will start sharing my screen. So in the previous lecture, you heard about how the concepts of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and climate change can help us reframe our understanding of racial justice. The focus of this lecture is on how the just transition movement has emerged from awareness and movement organizing, and lately also in academic spaces, of how colonialism, capitalism, and climate are intertwined, and how they shape the law and political economy we live in today. Before we get into the story, I have 3 images to show you. This first image is one that I like to share with my environmental justice students. This triangle conveys 2 things. First, the triangle is one way to crystallize what we learned in the previous lecture. The world history of white supremacy and settler colonialism is not separate from the world history of capitalism and its environmental dynamics of natural resource extraction, consumption, and waste production. Second, this triangle tells us that as we look to the future, in order to preserve our planet as we've known it, we have to rebuild our collective economic institutions, both in light of the ecological limits of our natural world and with the mission to redress and transform the interlocking systems of domination in the human world that have marked our past and continue to mark our present. In other words, for me, this triangle is an image of just transition. It's both a lens for understanding what's gone wrong and a map for showing us where to go from here. My second image is the social movement triangle, with thanks to my colleague, Jonathan London, founder of the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. Like other justice movements, the just transition movement gets its momentum from 3 distinct intertwined kinds of power. Resource power is what we can access as lawyers. Like scientists, planners, policymakers, doctors, and politicians, we have the power to shift resources and build new processes and institutions. But in exchange for that power, we have to accept our profession's norms of what's possible and what's realistic. People power is what non-professional folks have when they realize they have a shared interest in transformation and they begin to mobilize collectively. People power can change the frame of what's possible and realistic. But without access to resources, people power is mostly reactive, not proactive. Finally, idea power is everywhere, and it gets spread in different ways by academics, educators, and journalists who transmit ideas for a living, and by non-professional folks through conversation, organizing, social media, and study groups. Ideas need people, and they need resources in order to be transformative. And my third image speaks to the paradox we have as lawyers supporting this work. Law is both part of the problem and part of the solution when it comes to capitalism, colonialism, and climate change, and just transition. On the one hand, our legal institutions and structures keep unjust and unsustainable processes in place, and our lawyering can keep people disempowered. On the other hand, we as lawyers can align our resource power with people power and idea power to fight the bad and help build the new. The best way to navigate this paradox is to remind ourselves to be flexible, humble, and gentle with ourselves and with one another, and to keep our sense of humor. So with that, here's where we're going. First, I'll talk a little bit about the intellectual and political grandmother of just transition work, the environmental justice movement. Second, I'll say a little bit about some new ideas coming out of academia and justice movement theory that build on the concepts you heard about in the previous lecture to support the just transition. And third and finally, I'll identify some key ideas and developments for lawyers interested in supporting the just transition. The rest of the Institute will flesh out in detail the role of law and lawyers in bringing about the just transition. My goal in this lecture is just to identify a couple of anchor points that I hope will be helpful in the weeks to come as we build out this framework together. So here's the slide you'll see when it's time to take a break. Feel free to take a short pause now, and then let's get into it. In 1979, Linda McKeever Bullard, a Texas attorney, filed a class action lawsuit to stop a municipal landfill from being placed in a predominantly Black, middle-income Houston neighborhood. In connection with the suit, Linda asked her husband, Bob Bullard, a sociologist, to conduct a study on the placement of all Houston's municipal landfills. Through this study, the Bullards realized that the siting of locally unwanted land uses was highly racialized, disproportionately burdening Black communities. The Bullards also recognized that Houston was not unique. Throughout the South, in fact, throughout the United States and the rest of the world, toxic waste dumps, municipal landfills, garbage incinerators, and other locally unwanted land uses are never randomly scattered. They're concentrated in communities that are disproportionately poor and minority. How does this happen? In the 1990 book that came out of this research, Dumping in Dixie, Bob Bullard identified these inequalities as a form of structural racism, involving the interaction of economic, political, ecological, and social factors that together created and sustained a political economy designed to benefit whites at the expense of Blacks and other racialized groups. The book concluded that pollution is a civil rights issue. Of course, this recognition was nothing new. As Indigenous scholars have pointed out, the political struggle to hold on to Native practices of provisioning and land stewardship against capitalist practices of resource extraction and land degradation can be seen as the first and longest US environmental justice struggle. But the 1960s civil rights movement raised awareness in Black and Brown communities, both urban and rural, of the connections between racial subordination and environmental destruction, as in these examples. By the 1980s, racial justice organizers were beginning to mobilize resource power to document the connection between pollution and race. For example, after being arrested for participating in a protest against the Warren County, North Carolina dump mentioned in the previous slide, District of Columbia Representative Walter Fauntroy formally requested that the Government Accountability Office study the effects of race and class on the siting of landfills in the South. That landmark GAO study, on which the Bullards also relied, was just one of a host of studies which continue to be done today, demonstrating racialized disparities in environmental burdens, such as hazardous waste facilities, diesel exhaust, and pesticide and lead exposure, as well as racialized disparities in environmental amenities, such as access to parks and green space. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the connection between environmental health and civil rights grew even stronger with the introduction of new terms to describe the connection, such as environmental racism, environmental equity, and environmental justice. At the federal level, people power, resource power, and idea power combined to produce an order signed by President Bill Clinton in 1994 requiring federal agencies to identify and address disproportionate environmental burdens on poor and minority populations. But even though the idea that pollution is a civil rights issue and the broader idea of environmental racism captured both people power and resource power in the 1970s and 1980s, as a strictly legal concept, the idea has gotten very little traction. Why is that? First of all, civil suits that challenge environmental racism often face serious barriers relating to proof and to cause of action. As we know, the major constitutional and statutory provisions that prohibit racial discrimination, such as the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, require proof of racial animus, proof that an action was taken because of racial prejudice. This is nearly impossible to prove in environmental justice cases, both because decision makers know better than to state their biases out loud, and because by definition, the existence of structural racism means that there are always theoretically non-racial reasons for actions like citing a locally unwanted land use in a poor neighborhood. A second reason why litigation based on claims of environmental racism has gotten very little traction in the US is that it's extremely difficult to draw an uncontested line between, for example, racialized disparities in illness and death, and toxic emissions or pesticide exposure, whether on behalf of particular individuals or on behalf of entire communities. That's especially true when, as is often the case, these communities are multiply burdened with different kinds of polluting activities and suffer from the cumulative impacts of all of them. In addition, litigation based on environmental racism frequently faces cause of action barriers. For example, Section 602 of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 seems tailor-made for environmental justice claims. This section creates a civil rights claim for equitable injunctions and damages against programs receiving federal government assistance, whose activities have had a disparate impact on protected groups such as racial minorities. Yet the Supreme Court held in Alexander versus Sandoval that there is no private right of action under Section 602. There remains a private right of action under Section 601, but that section requires proof of discriminatory intent. A second example is the recent case of Juliana versus United States, in which a group of young people sued the federal government for continuing to permit, authorize, and subsidize fossil fuel extraction and consumption, despite these activities' contributions to global warming, but thereby infringing on their constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held that the plaintiffs had no standing to sue because injunctive relief requires limited and precise legal standards, and in the court's view, such standards exceeded the power of the judiciary to create. So the first reason why the idea of environmental racism as a civil rights issue never got legal traction was because of barriers within civil rights law. A second reason has to do with the limitations of environmental law. Earth Day 1970 is the day that's conventionally recognized as the birth of the second wave US environmental movement, as well as the basic federal statutes that constitute US environmental law: NEPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and more. Although these statutes have done much to protect Americans' lives and health overall, they've not done much to change the racialized disparities in environmental goods and bads. That's in part because the federal environmental administrative state is the product of a social movement that convinced the general public to care about the environment, but at the price of making environmental racism invisible. Some of the assumptions of mainstream environmentalism at this time included: pollution is a society-wide problem that affects us, that is everybody, equally. Pollution is the result of individual and household consumption. Pollution is a problem to be managed downstream at the point of waste, not upstream at the point of production. Pollution control should be managed by legal, scientific, and economic technical experts. And the people who care most about pollution control are the same people who care about wilderness protection, i.e. the same people who structured wilderness as a pristine experience for seekers of the sublime. As Luke Cole wrote in an important article in 1992, given these underlying assumptions, the lopsided distribution of environmental goods and bads is not a flaw in environmental regulation. It's how American environmental regulation was designed to work. Environmental regulations were not designed to shift the dynamics of power that allow affluent communities to influence administrative decision-making and political siting decisions. Indeed, as Cole recognized, encouraging poor and non-white communities to use the law to fight environmental injustice is setting them up for failure, because polluters generally have the money to hire boatloads of lawyers and the political power to shift the law in their direction. On the flip side, environmental law empowers economists, scientists, and policymakers to regulate and enforce regulations, and planners, governmental officials, and industry to control the timing and shape of new proposals. Environmental law in the US administrative state does envision the participation of ordinary people, but in carefully managed ways, as in notice and comment rulemaking. Environmental regulations were also not designed to shift the economic dynamics of power that make poor Black and brown communities desperate for jobs in polluting industries, and their neighborhoods cheap places to locate polluting facilities. The environmental regulatory state doesn't try to curb industry discretion to send new chemicals into the air, water, soil, and our bodies, or to develop processes like fracking or mountaintop removal that disrupt entire ecosystems. Instead, industry shapes the game, and government and people have to deal with the consequences after the fact. By the 1990s, awareness of the lack of effective civil rights remedies for environmental racism and the limitations of the environmental administrative state, combined with a frustration with the whiteness of mainstream environmentalism, all began to crystallize. In 1990, a nationwide group of advocates under the auspices of the Southwest Organizing Project sent an open letter to the so-called Group of 10, conservation and mainstream environmental organizations, calling them out for their failure to mobilize around environmental racism. And from October 21st to the 24th of 1991, delegates and observers met in Washington, D.C. for the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. As Luke Cole and Sheila Foster note in their book, From the Ground Up, it was not just civil rights folks who constituted the gathering or the movement as a whole. Instead, the summit brought together many different strands of activism. What united them all was their frustration with the limitations of both the mainstream environmental movement and the legal and social regime it created. For the organizers of the new movement for environmental justice, power was the key. Power is what distributes environmental goods and bads. For that reason, environmental racism is not a technical problem for scientists and engineers to solve. It's not a discrimination problem for good-hearted individuals or even litigators to solve. It's not a distribution problem for policymakers to solve. It's a structural problem, a problem in the way our political economy is designed. And as a structural problem, law is not only a solution, it's also part of the problem. The 1991 summit produced 17 famous principles of environmental justice. And the demands I've pulled out to the side here track the analysis of structural racism that you heard in the previous lecture. The participants in the summit recognized, as do just transition organizers today, that environmental racism at its core is a combined legacy of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. And now, let's take a break. So today, we're living in an increasingly scary time. Here's one of the charts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. illustrating on the left how the warming of the planet we're seeing today is unprecedented in more than 2,000 years. And on the right, the difference between the trends we're actually seeing and the trends we might expect if humans weren't affecting the climate. That slide compiled data going back to 1850. This is a famous older image compiling data going back to 1750, illustrating what the climate scientists call the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration marks the beginning of the era in the planet's history when human activities began to be the major driver of planetary systems. As we'll see, there are controversies over when we should say this era began, but we can agree that something important happens around 1950. We see a number of the factors being tracked here suddenly shifting dramatically upward. We can link this great acceleration with changes in global capitalism. Following World War II, many sectors of economic production began to be intertwined with the chemical and fossil fuel industries, creating spectacular rises in economic production, along with spectacular rises in environmental degradation. Here's where we reach the concept of the Anthropocene. Climate scientists invented this term as a way of memorializing the fact that human activity has so changed the basic systems that sustain planetary dynamics, including water cycles and weather patterns, that the planet can be said to have entered a new geological age. What are the conventional talking points behind this notion of the Anthropocene? That it's a universal human problem, a problem of man, the anthropos. Then it can and must be solved, if at all, through existing mechanisms. Market-driven solutions, both production and consumption side. Technology-driven solutions, such as geoengineering and carbon capture. And legal and policy solutions, including national commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and pivot away from fossil fuels, climate mitigation, and at the domestic level through commitments to manage infrastructural and economic responses, climate adaptation. The critiques of these assumptions made by today's climate justice advocates resonate strongly with the critiques that environmental justice advocates made back in 1991. First, uneven effects. Climate chaos doesn't affect everyone the same. Rather, its effects take shape through the power and structure, through problems in the way our global political economy is designed. And legal rules and institutions are not just part of the solution, they're also part of the problem. It hasn't only been environmental and climate justice activists who have diagnosed the structural nature of the problem. There have been dissenting and critical voices speaking out for decades. For example, in 1976, the ecologist Barry Commoner published a book entitled The Poverty of Power. In that book, he discusses three crises that the US was then struggling with: environmental pollution, the energy crisis, and an economic crisis in which the US was experiencing a recession and inflation at the same time, so-called stagflation. Commoner argued that these crises were actually all connected and that they all went back to what he called a single basic defect, a fault that lies deep in the design of modern society. Here's the design problem. Commoner asserted that today's modern human societies are driven by three basic material systems: the ecosystem, the production system, and the financial system. The financial system is about earnings, profit, credit, and debt, and it depends on the production of goods and services in the real economy, which in turn depends on what Commoner called the great natural interwoven ecological cycles that comprise the planet's skin and the minerals that lie beneath it. The arrow shows how these relationships should logically look. Ecological systems and cycles are the base, which determine the means and scale of economic production, and relationships of production in turn determine financial relationships of profit and investment. But what we actually have, Commoner argues, is an upside down global economic system. Under contemporary global capitalism, which includes even societies like China that are not liberal democracies, the pursuit of financial profit drives the terms of economic production, which in turn drives the terms of human, non-human relations. Moreover, Commoner points out that one of the things that's allowed this absurd upside-down system to survive for so long was the discovery of fossil fuels as a cheap source of energy. Releasing carbon creates so much energy that it's allowed for incredible increases in productivity and steep decreases in poverty in many places around the world. We've used that carbon energy to transform the means of production in all economic sectors, including sectors like agriculture, which is now entangled with the chemical and fossil fuel industries through pesticides, herbicides, and transportation. All of this activity also led to our friend, the Great Acceleration. Our upside-down social structure, driven by the remorseless search for financial profit, is now destabilizing basic planetary systems. Moreover, within this design, political institutions actually sit on top, meaning that our governments prioritize economic growth over ecological sustainability. It's the promise of endless economic growth that holds governments in place by making it seem like we can always solve inequality and social unrest by growing the pie. That way, no one ever has to give anything up, and we don't have to think about the possibility of redistribution. Governments treat constant economic growth as a kind of law beyond law, a commitment that underpins their very existence. Even today, as climate change is threatening to destroy the world, the primary way we see elites acknowledging it is with the promise that climate change adaptation and mitigation will create jobs and produce economic growth. Endless economic growth is the foundation of political stability. And this reliance on endless economic growth for political stability functions at the international level as well as the domestic level, creating one of the stickiest political barriers to taking action against climate change. Poor countries and rich countries both have an investment in postponing the issue of degrowth and redistribution by continuing to search for continued economic growth for everyone. This vulnerability means that governments have an implicit stake in placating the fossil fuel industry. And it means that environmental legal regulation, whether domestic or international, is not designed to threaten the carbon basis of our economy or the upside-down system itself. You might consider as you take this break whether Anthropocene is the right word for this moment, or whether you like the alternate word some people use, Capitalism. Let's take a breath. So Commoner's analysis is powerful, but there's still something missing. I want now to introduce a different story about the Anthropocene. In a 2015 article in Nature entitled "Defining the Anthropocene," geographers and climate scientists Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin suggested a new date to mark the beginning of the Anthropocene. They pointed to a planetary event they call the Orbis Spike, a dip in atmospheric CO2 occurring between 1570 and 1620, recorded in Antarctic ice cores. What does the Orbis Spike represent? Lewis and Maslin argue that it's a record in ice of the deaths of 50 million people. The colonization of the so-called New World led to the largest population replacement in the past 13,000 years, as well as to the mixing of previously separate biotas such as corn, maize, potatoes, sugarcane, wheat, and domesticated animals such as cows, rats, goats, and pigs in new ecological formations and the plantation ecologies of the Americas. The European invasion led to a decline from 54 million people living in the Americas in 1492 to approximately 6 million in 1650, a result of murder, enslavement, famine, and disease. This mass death, in turn, led to a massive reduction in farming and the regeneration of forests and carbon uptake or sequestration by forests, resulting in the observed decline in Antarctic ice cores of CO2 in the atmosphere. In other words, the Orbis spike. So why does it matter to push the date of the beginning of the Anthropocene from 1950 to 1750 to 1610? First, it matters because if we focus on the Orbis spike, we see in a deep way that the Anthropocene is not just an economic and technical story about fossil fuel dependence, or even a story about poor political economy design. It's also a political, social, and cultural story about colonialism. Second, it matters because the Orbis spike reminds us that the destruction of global climate isn't falling evenly on humanity. It follows the path dependencies of empire. Treating this moment as something happening to humanity in general obscures the fact that today's global political economy operates through international trade networks and political institutions designed to extract natural resources, land, and labor from the global south and turn it into capital for the benefit of the global north. And today, it's the countries of the global north, as well as the so-called developing nations who have adopted similar economic institutions and practices, who inflict dramatically larger carbon footprints than the poorest countries of the global south. At the same time, it's the countries of the global south who are experiencing some of the fastest moving and most serious climate catastrophes, along with the least amount of capacity to implement adaptation plans to deal with them. The countries of the global south are calling for climate reparations for centuries of land grabs and economic and ecological extraction, while the rich countries are calling this a crisis of all humanity. Third, it matters when we think the Anthropocene began, because our understanding of the design of capitalism through colonial political institutions and economic networks tells us something about what we can expect in the future. We can expect, as climate-related disasters mount, that the rich nations will be better able to protect themselves, and that they will use the language of racism, white supremacy, and xenophobia to keep people from poor nations, especially non-white people, from crossing their borders. Within nations, it's the South within the North. In the US, indigenous people, people of color, poor people, women, and children who breathe more for their size and absorb more toxins of every kind, who will suffer first and hardest from climate chaos. These are differentials of suffering that we saw in Katrina, that we see in the global pandemic, and that we will see again. Finally, it matters when we think the Anthropocene began, because if we take the Orbis spike story seriously, we can begin to build an integrated critique of capitalism, colonialism, and climate into better visions for moving forward. The good news is that this is already happening, both in academic spaces and in movement spaces. Let's start with my world, academia. Until pretty recently in law school, there was only one way to talk about markets, trade, corporations, and money, and that was law and economics. In fact, not only in business courses, but even in basic 1L courses like torts and contracts, students still learn to talk about allocative efficiency, externalities, free riders, and the Coase theorem. As I learned at the University of Chicago Law School in the 1980s, the function of the common law is to steer resources and rights to those who are willing to pay the most for them. But today, things are starting to change. Maybe because of the 2008 financial crisis and the Occupy movement, maybe because of Bernie Sanders, maybe because of the Fight for 15, and certainly because of the global pandemic, it's okay to talk about capitalism in law school again. An example is the emergence of a different frame for talking about economics, law and political economy, or LPE. LPE has two main themes. The first is a fact that should be obvious, but it hasn't always been. Markets are political. The second theme is that we can't forget the who. Who is our political economy for? When we ask that question, the answer brings us back to history and power. Some of the work that LPE scholars are doing has to do with taking apart the idea that economic activity happens in a special, separate world outside of politics and government, and that only professional economists can understand how it all works. So there's new historical and policy-related writing on money, not as something that evolved naturally from barter, but as something that's created by governments for specific purposes, such as conducting warfare. There are new theories of antitrust that return the idea to its original purpose, challenging corporate concentration, instead of the law and economics idea that antitrust law exists to keep consumer prices low. And there is lots of work that legal scholars are doing to question many of the basic concepts of neoliberal policy and neoclassical economics, like some of those listed here. As legal scholars take back some of the policy space from professional economists, we start to recognize that markets are legal and political through and through. That means there are no natural laws of economic activity. The economy is what we make it. The second LPE theme is asking, who is our political economy for? Building on some theories you might have heard of, historians and legal scholars today are using frameworks like decolonial theory and racial capitalism to ask new questions like those on the right. In general, the decolonial theory frame helps put US history and political economy in the context of global history and global political economy, linking the US to the story of global empire and colonialism. And the racial capitalism frame moves us away from a discrimination-based understanding of racism toward a structural understanding centered on economics and politics. There are even scholars like Athena Matua at the University of Buffalo and Carmen Gonzalez at Loyola University at Chicago. We integrate both frames, explicitly connecting theories of capitalism, colonialism, and climate change. This work is exciting, not just because it helps us understand how we got to this historical moment. It also helps rebuild the connections between indigenous political struggle and the forgotten history of third world decolonial struggle. For example, within the Black radical tradition. It creates new ways for Black, Indigenous, and people of the global majority to understand their common history and to move forward together. Meanwhile, on the ground, justice movements are both doing this critical work and beginning design work to plan more sustainable and just futures. Today, we have not only environmental justice, not only climate justice, but lots of justice movements. In my mind, all of these movements share at least 3 commitments that set us up for understanding the framework of just transition. These 3 commitments are intersectionality, an awareness of law's limitations, and a focus on human flourishing. Let me say a little bit about each of these commitments in turn. First, intersectionality. Today's justice movement organizing starts with the truth of the 3 E's. You have to think about ecology, economics, and equity simultaneously. So, for example, resource extraction and greenhouse gas emission is intertwined with the carbon economy, which is intertwined with the history of indigenous dispossession and international imperialism. Intersectionality is woven throughout this analysis. Intersectionality also means movement of movements organizing, connecting formerly disconnected silos of advocacy and practice. On the right, you see Principle 5 of the Climate Justice Alliance, Build the Bigger We. The second commitment common to justice movements is a clear understanding of the limits of law. Environmental justice advocates learned the hard way that building power, not getting a win in court, is the way to stop environmental racism. Today's justice movement organizers are not only putting building power first, they're also trying to imagine modes of governance that expand democratic self-determination in lots of different ways, including beyond existing legal frameworks. For example, democratizing governance through practices like participatory budgeting, transferring governance through recognition of indigenous sovereignty, downsizing legal governance, Movement generation out of Oakland suggests a basic principle that resources be managed at the most local level possible, consistent with ecological systems. Building systems of care, protection, and provisioning that don't depend on government at all, and that can be mobilized in moments of disaster and state failure. The explosion of mutual aid networks in 2020 during the pandemic, and the call to develop community responses to violence and defund the police are examples. Finally, movement generation's strategic framework for just transition emphasizes the need for new cultural traditions that can encourage us toward new ways of relating to the natural world, to economic activity, and to each other. This includes encouraging a worldview that centers caring and sacredness, approaches to work that center cooperation rather than competition, and attention to healing intergenerational trauma and promoting mindfulness, generosity, and nonviolence in the ways that we deal with each other day to day. Finally, today's justice movements focus not on the political and civil rights that our US Constitution protects, but on creating new rights that give everyone access to the basic goods that maintain human flourishing. A project that decolonial scholar Walter Mignolo describes as establishing not human rights, but life rights. This focus requires shifting our view of what economic analysis is, from the study of the allocation of scarce resources to the study of institutions that promote human and non-human flourishing. On the left, you see another excerpt from Movement Generation's Strategy for a Just Transition, discussing the fact that at the root of ecosystem, ecology, and economy is the word eco, which means home. This excerpt suggests the purpose of our economy could be turning land, life, and labor into property for a few, or returning land, life, and labor into a balanced web of stable relationships. This focus on life rights also fuels the movement to take certain necessities for life on Earth out of market allocation entirely. On the right, you see one of the pillars of the movement for Black lives, Red, Green, and Black New Deal, which is promoting water as a human right, not a commodity. This all brings us to the idea of just transition. The term just transition first emerged in the labor movement, where it referred to protecting workers and communities who depend on high carbon industries from bearing a disproportionate burden of the costs of decarbonization. In the climate context, just transition refers to a couple of related ideas. First, whereas environmental justice struggles tend to focus on resisting the bad, just transition combines fighting the bad with building the new, calling into play a design imagination to rethink basic institutions, practices, and ideas around ecology, economics, and social justice. Second, in the climate space, just transition draws on the original labor movement's meaning of the term, using equity as the central value to guide us as we try to get from where we are to where we want to be in our ecological and economic relations. That's a lot. Let's take a break. So Oakland's movement generation has created this strategy framework for just transition chart that attempts to map all of the moving parts of the transition from what they call the extractive economy that we're in to the regenerative economy we want to be in. And here's how they describe the regenerative economy. So how can lawyers support this work? Let me remind you that the entire rest of the Institute will be devoted to answering this question in detail. So what I'm going to do here is just offer a couple of ideas. The rest will be filled in by the experts who are doing the work, and by you if you join us in making it happen. As we saw in part 2 of this presentation, one of the distinctive features of the Just Transition framework is that it looks in 2 directions at once, both at fighting the bad and building the new. Fighting the bad is pretty much what we lawyers are trained to do. In the context of Just Transition work, this means at least 2 things. First, it means using our legal training to resist environmental racism and climate injustice across a wide variety of practice areas. This might mean doing what you're already doing, but seeing how it relates to very different kinds of legal practice. Or it might mean shifting the focus of what you do to push the larger movement forward. Second, fighting the bad means lawyering in a way that recognizes the central strategy of justice movements to build power for vulnerable communities. Recall, for instance, the Hemes principles mentioned in an earlier presentation. Building the new calls upon lawyers to put on a different hat, lawyer as social and institutional designer. There are at least two kinds of work here too. First, there's the work of imagining and building out legal institutions and practices that will be ecologically sustainable, as well as socially and economically just. And second, there's the work of helping all of us, but especially the most vulnerable, build resilience to cope with unknown futures. I want to end this presentation by offering a couple of examples of what this building new might look like. My first example is the idea of the commons. In academia, one of the sources of this idea is economist Elinor Ostrom's prize-winning work on governing common pool resources, shared resources such as fishing grounds, groundwater basins, or grazing areas. Ostrom proved to the economics profession that humans can share and sustain these kind of resources without having to own them through legal regimes of either private property or government ownership and management, something that, of course, Indigenous people already knew. Scholars such as David Bollier take the idea of the commons further, not to describe certain kinds of resources that people manage together, but to describe the entire process through which people self-organize outside of existing market and state institutions to create sustainable, cooperative ways of interacting with the environment to get the things we want to live. Bollier likes to talk about commoning as a verb, something people do, not the name for a kind of thing or a kind of institution. As a social movement, this larger sense of the word commons has taken off, and it's linked to the notion of a solidarity economy. This image of the solidarity economy, and you can see inside of it some examples of what it includes, illustrates the use of the 3 E's triangle in a forward-looking way as a blueprint for building a more just and sustainable society. Rather than being organized around sending resources to those who are most willing to pay for them and allowing those with the most money to extract more, the solidarity economy organizes economic relations around the promotion of healthy human relationships and the promotion of healthy relationships between humans and the non-human world. Let me be clear here that the solidarity economy is not at all the same as the sharing economy promoted by platform companies such as Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft. The corporate so-called sharing economy is really a gig economy dependent on extracting labor from people at the bottom without giving them access to any of the benefits of employment and encouraging them to think of themselves as entrepreneurs instead of as employees without employment rights. And because of its reliance on venture capital and labor hyper-extraction through avoiding legal responsibilities, the gig economy actually decreases solidarity. So what do lawyers have to do with the real solidarity economy? Here's an example from the Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland. In September 2013, SELC and the nonprofit Shareable issued a policy paper called Policies for Shareable Cities, a primer directed toward urban planners. This document covers food, transportation, employment, and housing, covering some of the legal initiatives necessary to open the policy space for building a solidarity economy. These include zoning changes to promote more low-income accessible housing, promotion of the cooperative form instead of the corporate form for new small businesses, allowing urban folks to grow food and sell both produce and value-added products, and much more. And this is a list of some of the policies they promoted with respect to food in the solidarity economy. It's important to notice that this kind of just transition work doesn't require an anti-capitalist revolution or even passing a federal infrastructure bill. This is local action that creates the conditions right now for making the next bigger leap and the next. The kind of policy changes that the late sociologist Eric Olin Wright called eroding capitalism. Things possible and realistic right now that hold the space for the next thing. Instead of waiting for the revolution to get rid of capitalism, we build new institutions in the cracks with some of these key ideas. The economy as relationships, both with each other and with the earth, and transforming unjust systems by repairing some of the broken relationships we have with human communities and with the planet. The second example of building the new, which is the one I'll leave you with, is the idea of changing the legal subject. This is a much bigger swing, but again, it's not an idea for the future. This legal work is happening now. So one reason why the idea of environmental racism as a civil rights issue hasn't gotten much legal traction is the way that we organize legal actors and the rights that they hold. Think about the way the law distributes rights and responsibilities to three kinds of legal subjects. First, people in the United States don't have social or economic rights the way that people in other countries with more up-to-date constitutions do. In the US, there are no legal rights to basic life-sustaining public goods such as healthcare, sanitation, clean air, or water. Instead, these are all commodities, either allocated through private markets or controlled by bureaucracies. Second, consider the law of corporations as legal entities in the US. Corporations enjoy many political and civil rights, including constitutional free speech rights. They enjoy limited liability. They're governed by managers who are required to prioritize the short-term profit interests of shareholders and not consider the long-term interests of stakeholders such as workers. Corporations are mobile and can easily cross borders or operate in multiple spaces at once, while labor is hampered by political and real-life limitations. And corporations are permitted to externalize the ecological and social costs of their activities. Third and finally, consider the legal subjecthood of land, non-human animals, and natural formations like rivers and entire ecosystems. These are generally treated in economic and social life as commodities or natural resources, objects of fee simple private ownership, meaning that there is no collective or social interest in preserving or manage them into the future, that they are lacking protectable interests other than those designated by their human quote unquote owners, and that they are considered fully interchangeable with cash, as well as capable of being turned into new commodities through financialization. So what if we could change some of these attributes of legal personhood? I've already suggested that justice movements are fighting for life rights, and that the solidarity economy prioritizes the cooperative form over the corporate form. A third example of this effort to change the legal subject is the rights of nature movement, also known as earth jurisprudence. So several years ago, representatives of the Haudenosaunee people from what is now the American Northeast, also known as the Iroquois, presented a conference paper to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, with the intention to document the fact that they were never conquered. They relied on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which calls for the right to redress for stolen lands. And their larger aim was to save the earth, according to Tanya Fritschner, who founded the American Indian Law Alliance and served as North American regional representative to the UN Forum. Fritschner wrote these words: "Indigenous peoples are woven into the biological fabric of their traditional territories, which they are charged with a sacred responsibility to maintain for future generations. By taking back the land, Indigenous peoples around the world are prepared to once again take on this responsibility. Recovering Indigenous sovereignty in the form of land rights is one way of accomplishing this. Another way is through granting rights to non-human entities themselves." Here are some examples. In 2008, the Constitution of Ecuador granted rights to nature as an entity. The philosophy underneath this initiative was not the Anglo-American common law tradition, but rather the tradition of indigenous Amazonian peoples. And in 2012, the New Zealand government recognized the rights of the Whanganui River. The agreement recognizes the river as a single entity with legal rights and interests, and as the owner of its own riverbed. The Maori communities affiliated since time immemorial with the Whanganui River are now recognized as joint custodians with the government, entrusted to protect the river for present and future generations. Closer to home, in October 2016, the state of Hawaii adopted a new code of practice and procedure for an advisory committee within the state's Department of Land and Natural Resources. This advisory committee is made up of Native Hawaiian members representing each of the islands of Hawaii, and it has embraced Native Hawaiian customs of stewardship. On the right are a few of the terms from the definition section. Native Hawaiian stewardship recognizes 7 resource realms to be considered in making decisions, including the rainbows. This committee's work doesn't directly create rights for nature, but note this language. Care for these resources are based on their intrinsic value. Management is based on providing for the benefit of the resources themselves, rather than from the perspective of how these resources serve people. So restoring Indigenous sovereignty and establishing legal rights to nature itself are intertwined. And both of these legal projects adopt an integrated view of sustainability. Rather than the current model in which nature, people, and the economy have separate but overlapping interests, the rights of nature model imagines nature as the biggest circle that holds and sustains people and their economies. So with that, you and I have made it to the end of this presentation. I hope I've given you a few insights about where the just transition framework comes from, both historically and intellectually, what some of the basic ideas behind just transition are, and the academic and movement theory that supports them, and where lawyers might fit in the movement. One thing I hope you come away with is that when we think about capitalism, colonialism, and climate change, not as 3 separate issues, or even 3 overlapping issues, but as 3 aspects of a single story, a triple crisis, we understand better where we've come from in our history, where we're at today, and where we might want to go. Thank you so much for your time, your attention, your thoughtfulness, and your patience while I worked through the script of this lecture in real time with no second takes. Again, I'm so excited that you're here for this institute, and I look forward to building out our network and our framework together. Thank you.